before we get in talking about the USAID freeze and the shock it's given to the system, is that we're not talking about a robust system suddenly thrown into crisis. We're witnessing a system already at its breaking point before the new news in 2025.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. When a man-made or natural disaster strikes, aid agencies need to go to donors hat in hand and fundraise for the response. This includes UN agencies like the World Food Program and UNICEF, and also international NGOs like the International Rescue Committee and Save the Children. Over the years, the UN created a mechanism to consolidate these appeals through the Office of the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA. It's a rather straightforward and streamlined process at this point. Aid agencies explain their needs, and donors make pledges to fund the response. The United States has historically been the largest single donor, accounting for about 40% of all funding for emergency humanitarian relief. And now, that funding has been abruptly cut. The reverberations from this action have been profound for both people who receive humanitarian assistance and professionals who have devoted their careers to relief work. As my guest today, Thomas Byrnes, explains, the freezing of U.S. foreign aid and the dismantling of USAID have caused a collapse of the global humanitarian system, the ripple effects of which we discuss in detail. Thomas Byrnes is the director of Market Impact, which is a humanitarian and development consultancy firm. We kick off discussing how the global humanitarian system works, why the United States was the linchpin, and the near and long-term implications of the total upending of how the world deals with humanitarian crises. This conversation, I think, exposes listeners who are unfamiliar the true degree of the shock to the international humanitarian system that the freezing of U.S. foreign aid and the dismantling of USAID have inflicted. I learned a lot from this conversation. I know you will as well. And I do want to make one important announcement. UN Dispatch, which is the blog I started about the UN nearly 20 years ago, is now moving to Substack. We are shifting to a crowdfunding model, and I need your support to keep our coverage of the United Nations alive and thriving. UN Dispatch will be a section of the Global Dispatches Substack, where you can access exclusive analysis and news about the United Nations. You can go to the link in the show notes of this episode to purchase a subscription with a 40% discount, and I hope you will do so. I need your support to keep doing what I'm doing. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Thomas Byrnes, Director of Market Impact. Thomas, thanks so much for joining me today. Just to kick off, can I have you explain broadly how funding for responding to global humanitarian crises work? And then we can get into the American role in that system.
So first of all, while people do like to think, it's the money we're giving £2 a month or €2 a month or $2 a month is what we see as the majority of humanitarian assistance. In reality, what we actually have is a very organized industry or sector where we have humanitarian agencies working with the United Nations to do assessments of what is the amount of funding needed for life-saving assistance in different countries. That is then put together as a global appeal, and then that is submitted out into the world, primarily for major institutional donors. like the United States, the EU, the European countries and the UK, as well as others, to provide grants to these humanitarian actors, to the UN agencies, to provide this assistance, looking to fill these gaps that were identified.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically an appeal that goes out based on needs generated from a particular crisis. That appeal gets consolidated by the UN, and then other donors go and fill certain gaps or make pledges and contributions against that appeal.
Yeah, that is correct. One of the things that's also very important to understand, though, is that before we get in talking about the USAID freeze and the shock it's given to the system, is that we're not talking about a robust system suddenly thrown into crisis. We're witnessing a system already at its breaking point before the new news in 2025. The scale of humanitarian needs in 2024 was staggering. The Global Humanitarian Needs Overview was requesting nearly $50 billion of assistance. But the crucial point is that even last year, we didn't get $50 billion. In fact, cumulatively, UN tracked only around $23 billion, which means that half of the funding was not already funded, if that makes sense. That's a dramatic increase in people in need who are saying are needing assistance, but also a substantial decrease year on year of over 20% going from 2020 down. So already many agencies were doing budget cuts, were already in a stressed situation and having to prioritize before this USAID freeze has now come into effect. So I think that's just an important phrasing point.
Yeah, and maybe just even set deeper context. When I started covering these issues 20 years ago in 2005, the total amount up for appeal was about like $5 or $6 billion. Now, as you said, it's about $50 billion, and that's a consequence of a proliferation of crises, of climate change, of like a massive refugee crisis that the world has been experiencing for the last 10 years at least. And so you have these compounding issues that are causing surging humanitarian needs around the world to the point where you said we're at $50 billion this year, yet only half of that money is ever actually allocated. So we were already in this really fragile position, this breaking point, as you called it. Now, layered on top of this is the dismantling of USAID and the foreign aid freeze imposed by the Trump administration. What role has the United States traditionally played in confronting these humanitarian crises? And what impacts thus far are we seeing from this foreign aid freeze?
So first remark, it's not an understatement to say that USAID was the cornerstone of the entire global humanitarian response system. 2024, the United States provided over $13.8 billion to humanitarian assistance. So that's more than 43% of the total amount. And to put it in perspective, that's greater than the next 10 donors of countries put together cumulatively. As a result, it's not only just as a 43%, it's hard to say, for the World Food Programme, which, it provides life-saving food assistance around the world, USAID was 54% of the total funding. $4.6 billion went to World Food Programme last year. The UN High Commission for Refugees received 54% of its funding, amounting to nearly $2 billion from USAID. And these aren't just significant contributions, they're the financial background to these organizations and many other organizations. And also what many people don't realize is how interconnected a humanitarian ecosystem is. These UN agencies don't implement all programs directly. They work through a network of international NGOs, faith-based organizations, and local national organizations who serve as implementing partners. So, trying to calculate the impact of this freeze and stoppages has been incredibly difficult for us because it impacts so many steps down the supply chain. And it creates a multi-layered crisis where the UN agencies suddenly lack operational funds, where their partners have made financial commitments signed based on these agreements with UN agencies, which they can't now implement. And crucially, local NGOs are the most hardest hit of all, often the key actual actors implementing across health, across education, across emergency food, across water and sanitation. And they have the smallest reserves and often depend entirely on funding flows from large organizations that has almost entirely stopped because of the liquidity freeze that has now impacted these agencies. So it's like pulling a critical support beam from the middle of a structure. but damage spreads outwards and upwards throughout the entire system. And the second order impacts, we are still trying to even ascertain it.
And it's worth just emphasizing a point you made earlier that structure, to use your metaphor, was already crumbling. And this just pulls out, as you noted, that final important support beam. There's been some speculation about future impact of this freeze, but there has already been immediate impact from this freeze and from the cutoff of American support for the global humanitarian system. What are you hearing? What are you seeing of the impacts already felt?
So the key point, which is where here is, I would say operational paralysis is where we almost are. It's not just that the contracts are frozen or future funding is uncertain. It's that over $1.5 billion, according to DevEx's estimates, of funding for work that was already done hasn't been paid. And so the moment the freeze came down, payments were not made. So we have agencies suddenly act unclear if they are even solvent. To be bluntly honest, we have, hundreds of millions of dollars owed to different agencies. To Norwegian Refugee Council has put out clearly that they owed $22 million from already completed work, which means that they don't have, without knowing if that cash flow is coming in, they haven't been able to, even for donors who aren't directly, or programs who aren't directly affected, they have immediately had to make redundancies. They've immediately had to stop traveling. They've had to immediately stop operations in many locations, because not only do they not know if they're going to get paid for the work that they've already done, they don't know if they do, based on vague definitions of life-saving assistance, if they pay for the truck to take the food from that warehouse and distribute it, or the flour and give it to that bakery, they don't know if they will ever get that funding back, or they may have to be many months of litigation. And at that point, so that has been the key issue. This has caused a system-wide seizure of the entire humanitarian machine over the last few weeks, where agencies have been desperately trying to work out what is their exposure, what can they continue, and what they have to prioritize. Can they prioritize funding for Sudan because it is absolutely life-saving? But again, these are very hard decisions, and it's very difficult for such huge organizations to rapidly get this understanding. And so we're seeing a mass exodus of expertise, creating a devastating brain drain. Again, NRC was very public about it, but we know this from many other organizations who are letting thousands of staff go. Mm-hmm. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are dedicated professionals with specialized skills, deep local knowledge, and decades of accumulated experience are being let go immediately and being forced out of the sector. And so we're losing a generation of humanitarian expertise that's irreplaceable and essential for aid delivery. Because that's one thing that was noted is it's almost a miracle that we even are able to do aid delivery in many of these locations, considering the context, considering the limited funding. It's been miraculous that we have been able to provide the limited support that we have. And so this specter of financial ruin is really creating, massive funding cuts. It's leading to procurements of nearly all sorts being frozen, which means while agencies may be able to distribute the food in the warehouse today, they aren't placing the orders which for those foods, which will take 3 months to arrive, to take place. So we're seeing a huge impacts on supply chains, different pipelines. And as I said, this is causing immediate life-saving work, immediate, maternity units with NICUs where the power has just turned off. Bakeries providing food, over 600 bakeries in Sudan providing subsidized bread to people in famine situations, just stopping. This isn't a gradual slowdown. It wasn't we're phasing out. It was an abrupt freeze, stop right now. And that means activities that were keeping people alive in water and sanitation, in refugee camps, and where we have cholera outbreaks, activities providing clean water or taking away solid waste or, have just stopped overnight. So again, this is massive issues here. We're also witnessing wider systems. We saw a FuseNet, which is a gold standard for famine prediction, is now offline.
The famine early warning system, which was a USAID supported platform that does exactly what its name suggests.
Exactly. Its website is offline. So is its learning platform. So is its data repository. And this significantly today degrades our ability to monitor and forecast food insecurity in the Sahel and many other regions, precisely when multiple food crises are looming. in this case, imagine a ship blindly sailing into a hurricane with its radar deliberately disabled. I mean, that's the level of recklessness we're witnessing here. And it's a stark symbol of a system not just in paralysis, but actively being dismantled.
So you have this massive shock to the system that, despite being chronically underfunded, still was doing what it was set up to do, which is to save lives in crises. And now you have the upending of that system because its single largest donor has just abruptly stopped funding. How have other donors responded thus far?
Well, unfortunately, not positively, because the larger geopolitical points of this is that of not just the USAID freeze, but the wider US actions and the global environment is pushing more and more back towards a defense. We've seen the UK cutting foreign aid as the lowest hanging fruit, where they need to increase GDP on defense right now. And we're seeing this across the board of countries thinking we are going to have to spend more at home, we have to spend it more on defense. And so, the new German government is likely to have to reduce its overseas development budget. We've also seen cuts already in Switzerland and Netherlands. So far from donors being able to fill this gap, the institutional donors, we're in fact seeing them likely going to have to make cuts. And this is even before the fact that all foreign aid is linked to percentages of GDP, or normally granted that way. And if we're looking at a global trade war, which are going to have economic impacts, that will also reduce the ability of the major institutional donors to provide support. One thing is also worth pointing here. The US support to the system was not purely financial. And I think that's a really important point that we want to make clear there, which is that the US played a key role convening and enabling these different activities. In public health, their billions of dollars of programming provided the basis of systems that, like Bill and Melinda Gates and other foundations built on, or other actors worked on. They also played a key role in diplomacy with their strong embassies in a convening power, bringing together different donors, bringing together different humanitarian actors, and putting pressure on national governments to engage and work together to resolve these different issues. So it's not just the step back on financing, which is catastrophic. It is also these wider activities that the US government and the US State Department and USAID were providing, particularly on public health, but also across a wide range of points that are now missing, and which there aren't necessarily actors with that capacity in these countries to step up or having the ability to provide that role.
One kind of big picture question I wanted to ask you, and I know we've been talking about very specific facts and figures, which is, of course, very important. But for as long as I have been covering this sector, I have always seen and heard warnings of the impending collapse of the global humanitarian system, that it's at its breaking point, for the fact that, for reasons you described earlier, that the humanitarian needs were never commensurate with the kind of funding and political will that was there to solve the root of the problem or meet the immediate humanitarian challenges caused by crises, both natural and man-made. But it seems now we are actually at that breaking point. There is the collapse of the humanitarian system before our eyes right now. And so I'm curious to learn from you, like, what does that mean? What does that look like? What does a world in which the humanitarian system has collapsed look like and mean, and what does the future hold?
We are likely probably to see some national or international NGOs fail and just in the next couple of weeks cease to operate. But we aren't likely to see the big UN agencies. We will see a massive contraction, but we're not likely to see as much those activities stopping. What we are probably going to see is an increasing amount of the world which are not having this Western-funded humanitarian support system and they supporting national governments. And it's worth noting that a lot of majority of response is still going to be by people in their own countries helping each other when it's natural disasters or conflict. We will see, probably the example would be like Afghanistan after the US withdrawal, when humanitarian funding abruptly ceased. And while the needs were still there, the actual activities obviously reduced dramatically and many more people died. We're probably going to see areas of the world which are not seen as geopolitically important just left, as it was back in the 90s when the second Congo war took place and hundreds of thousands of people died. There wasn't necessarily the humanitarian system stepping in. If there is increased conflict, increased instability in these locations, we're going to see that supporting environment of this humanitarian infrastructure maybe not operating there at all, or if it is operating at a much, much reduced level. Funding from donors is linked to their priorities. We will still see a lot of funding to the countries around the EU for stopping migration to the EU. But that may mean countries across the Sahara, around the world aren't covered. And we also are seeing in the short term, probably a dramatic reduction in the ability for rapid response, because we are seeing massive redundancies at regional offices, headquarters, global teams, which means if we had another Asian tsunami style situation or natural disaster, we may not be able to deploy, or we would be able to respond less efficiently. And obviously, if we had another bird flu or COVID style disease outbreak, we also probably wouldn't be able to detect it maybe as quickly, but also provide those support. So again, the system will likely retract and, consolidate maybe more down on core humanitarian principles, but we'll see the exiting out of whole regions of substantial support.
Honestly, one thing that kind of keeps me up at night is what happens when there's a next major cyclone or a major earthquake. And, we have seen, for reasons you described earlier, there's like this professionalization of this sector. There are real people with just profound technical expertise in how to respond to a cyclone, how to respond to an earthquake in like Kathmandu. And those people are now out of jobs at the moment. And so one real damaging outcome from all of this, I would think, is that, yes, we have these kind of slow burning man-made crises like in the DRC or in Sudan. But what happens when that big one hits that everyone's waiting for in Kathmandu, or the next cyclone to hit somewhere in the Philippines? That is sort of a frightening prospect for me, because these are like the world's first responders, right? These are the emergency medical services that, swoop in to crises after a natural disaster has struck.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it's impossible to quantify because the information is hard to see. But yeah, objectively speaking, if you take half of the funding out of the system, and very rapidly, if Amazon lost 50% of its turnover overnight and all of its contracts, what would that be about impact? It's much bigger than a small gradual pressuring that we've had there. But the other point, a lot of humanitarian assistance is not purely altruistic. It definitely costs a lot less to deploy a UN peacekeeper than it does to have an intervention. But really, humanitarian assistance has been often seen, probably detrimental to neutrality, through the lens of security interests. And we are seeing, in northeast Syria, overnight, when the first aid freezes came down, the guards in charge of the camps in northeast Syria, our whole camp, with ISIS terrorists on them, all just were told, no, leave and walk away, destabilizing that entire region. Reuters aptly noted that in Somalia, food security is also national security. And it's a key point. When people are desperate and basic services collapse, extremist groups exploit those vacuums. And we risk undermining years of costly counterterrorism efforts and creating conditions for renewed violence in the regions where the US has heavily invested in stability. And again, this is self-replicating. This violence will beget more violence, which causes more instability. And again, that wider retractment of there is no peacekeepers coming, there's no intervention going to happen, there's not even necessarily even food kits or emergency water and hygiene. So all these elements here are adding incredible instability into an already unstable system. People are still going to have very good information. They will still be seeing on their TV, they'll be getting information about why this is happening, what's the wider points, and the impacts of that are going to be substantial.
It could be the case that this U.S. cutoff is permanent or near permanent, at least for the short and medium term. What can the global humanitarian system do to respond to this and to do what it still can to respond to crises as best it can around the world, given this new reality, what are some of the solutions out there to still save lives in crises?
So the first thing is we must abandon wishful thinking. The humanitarian sector and many people have almost been going through the 5 phases of grief. And denial has been a big one where the Supreme Court will overturn this or Congress will push back. But the reality is the US government is entitled to spend its funding the way that it sees. And it's clear on what their agenda is and what they're pushing there. So the first thing is organizations, and they really have started this week, have had to really recognize that the future is going to have substantially reduced US funding, which means that they need to start communicating transparently about what that means for them and what's no longer possible. Because right now it's very hard for the wider sector to really understand. We don't know what the impact really on the World Food Programme is, which is the biggest actor, or these other UN agencies. There's almost no information. The silence is deafening. So without knowing what they expect those problems, it's very hard for the other actors to coordinate and work. The second, though, practically wise, moving from the short term, is that triage is inevitable. We often talk about targeting humanitarian assistance or but we must return to the core. We're going to return to that core humanitarian mandate of preventing death and alleviating acute suffering. And this is going to mean making very hard choices about which programs and populations to prioritize based on immediate life-threatening needs. And these aren't going to be win-win solutions. There will be losers and people will die based on these decisions. But many important but less urgent programs will simply have to be suspended. I don't say that with any relish, but it is the actual brutal accounting of it. And this crisis probably will then demand radical transformation, not incremental adjustments. The UN is often called the World Civil Service. And yes, it is bureaucratic and it is inefficient. And there are inefficiencies in how this sector has grown over the last 70 years. And that's going to mean that we're likely going to have to see consolidation. We need to see mergers, partnerships, and unfortunately some organizational closures. And competition may have to give way to collaboration. The way that the current humanitarian system is set up with clusters and UN agencies with mandates is how we have managed to try and solve a very difficult problem. But if we can't solve that with the resources, if we now need to consolidate more on saying, well, why is UNICEF and UNHCR both giving hygiene kits and blankets on a refugee camp when the World Food Programme already has a logistics supply chain to do food? Why can't that all be consolidated? So these are hard questions because they involve people losing jobs and and we're also talking about massive organizational change in a reduced funding environment where there will be losers. But the reality is harsh, and acknowledging what is the reality and what is the purpose of what we are doing is the first step to adaptation. And the reality is the majority of humanitarians have grown up in an era of relative abundance, where funding always increased year on year. And there was always a new grant to cover inefficiencies here. And that is unlikely to be the case. With increased global conflict, with decreased funding, and, just set aside the wider impacts of climate change and a growing world population, we need to recognize these hard truths with courage and a commitment to minimize harm to ensure that what are these core functions that need to be maintained. And there's nothing that any humanitarian actor is doing which is pointless. Unfortunately, we've got to work out what are the things that can be cut that will do the least harm and what things must be maintained now to maintain, the most support to the most number of people, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And you did a really excellent job of explaining this to me and to the audience. Thank you so much for your time, Thomas.
No, it's my absolute pleasure, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.